Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever it may be. Welcome back to the final installment of the Master Craftsman Symbolic Lodge discussion. We're excited to join with you today as we break into that final section and we cover our bases. This is kind of an interesting section, to be honest. As we get in the material, you'll figure out why, as there's a little bit more just free flow thought here. And I would encourage you in this section to definitely take some time to kind of do some self-analysis over some of this material as you work through it. Again, as kind of our general disclaimer, this material is developed as overview. It is meant to be listened to or watched after you have read the prescribed reading. The prescribed reading for this section is the lesson that covers the 47th problem of Euclid, the fragments at the end of the lectures, and the endnotes section. So please take some time to review that and kind of wrap your mind through all of it. Very important stuff that you have that knocked out, that reading knocked out before you listen to our material here. If you're a participant in the Valley of St. Louis Master Craftsman Study Group programs, which this was developed for, that is a requirement. But we'd also make sure you're not listening to this beforehand, before we've completed any of the other lectures, that type of thing. If you're completing this solo or not with our Valley program, just listening to it in order after you've made those readings will definitely be a benefit. So let's get ready to jump in. We're glad to have you here. And remember, Masonic education matters. But let's dive in. Let's make a nice little push through this material. There's quite a large slide deck here, but a lot of it's visuals as we get into it. So that should speed things up. We're going to first jump into lesson 5, the 47th problem of Euclid. And Pike begins this discussion in the text talking about the right angle of a triangle being the sum of the squares of its base and perpendicular and equal to the square hypotenuse, the line which connects them. Pike just describes what the 47th problem of Euclid explains, and its basis as a theorem. He then goes on and kind of takes off one of his general riffs that he does, as I call the cranky or grumpy past master discussions, where he talks about the litany of diagrams and tracing boards. And we've seen these, of course, in our own lodges, in Masonic museums, libraries, that type of thing, where they describe the problem in various ways. And he also talks about the individual brothers who spend hours and hours discussing the problem and its significance and using diagrams. But to Pike, all of these never expressed, as he put it, a single lucid idea, and really never communicated anything to him that he felt was worthwhile. So for all the rambling and postulating, it leads us to one question. If there's all these different ideas, Pike says they're just kind of rambling and offset. What is the practicality of it? What is the use of the 47th problem? Well, pretty simply, of course, it does have a practical use. It's used to make square corners, which then devolve into quite a greater scope of other things that it can be involved with in terms of the idea of masonry or architecture or planning or anything where you need measurements to be just exacting. Now, of course, from a monitorial standpoint, we're told that the discovery of this theorem, Pythagoras sacrificed 100 oxen. Now, that in itself is interesting. Why would he sacrifice 100 ox? Pythagoras himself and his followers were vegetarians. They didn't really eat meat. So there's something to scratch your head about. But he does really show reverence, at least in the theory of our ritual, as it being an important symbol. He calls it a great symbol. Now, of course, Pythagoras never titles any other theorem a great, a symbol itself. So some interesting things to think about there. Of course, we all know the story behind this as we discuss it has its own loose ends to be tied up. But in general here, why was it a great symbol? What makes the 47th problem so important? What leads us to that knowledge? Well, key to this, of course, is obviously, first off, for our own observations, most tracing board representations are in error. The problem's not drawn correctly. There's slight issues, that type of thing. But Pike himself notes that when we look at the problem, which at least in its general theorem is always described as a 3-4-5 triangle, Pike rolls this to the idea of the altar lights within a quick beat. And he says that represents the theorem, and it still does in some jurisdictions. Of course, he talks about the two altar lights in his description for the EA Lodge, or the Entered Apprentice Lodge, being east of the altar, north and south of each other, 3 feet apart. The third one being due west on the north, and it being 4 foot from it. He then iterates that the Master Mason's Lodge would be the same, with a group of 3 sets of candles, so 3 by 3, so 9 candles total. Now, this discussion on numbers and 3, 4, 5, as used with the Pythagorean theorem, Pike kind of takes a digression. He begins talking about numbers and their symbolism in general. I would encourage you to look at pages 192, 193, 194 in your text, as this covers kind of the litany of things he talks about. But he talks about this idea of sacred numbers, magic numbers, mystical numbers, however you want to term them. 3, 5, 7, 9, of course, being prominent in Masonry, being prominent in the Scottish Rite and other bodies, and especially the biblical examples he gives relating to the number 7 draw our attention. He talks about the 7 trumpets that sound at the apocalypse, Solomon's temple being built in 7 years, in the 7th month of Zerubbabel was sent to rebuild the temple, that there are 6 days of creation, God rests on the 7th day. Job has 7 sons, 3 daughters, that equals 10. Perhaps that's something tied to the Kabbalistic tree of life and the 10 Sephiroth. Of course, Zechariah was told that the Lord had 7 eyes. So all this repetition, as Pike is looking at numbers, he's trying to put this whole concept together. He comes to this conclusion, referencing the number 7. It is used, as you have seen, not only in directions for purification and sacrifice, and in regard to persons and potencies of angels and deity, but in regards to things of many different kinds, and its continual reoccurrence shows that there is some peculiar importance attached to it, and it is invested with peculiar significance. Taking it a step back and broader, Pike does note that other faiths, other practices use the number 7 in various ways. The Vedas speak of 7 horses pulling the chariot of Agni. There are 7 planets, including the sun, known to exist to the ancients. Per Hebrew text, per the Hebrew belief, Judaic beliefs, there were 7 archangels. Ahura Mazda, who we're going to talk a lot about later, 4 male and 3 female emanations were said to come from him in the Amish Sepentas. Of course, going back to farther thought process with other numbers, we have the triple interlaced triangle, 3 by 3 with those 9 points. You can find some symbolism there carried on further to this idea of numbers and symbolism outside. This is just, of course, a short hit list of what was touched on in various ways. Now, specifically, Pike is going to dial in on Ahura Mazda and the Amish Sepentas. The Amish Sepentas are 7 in number, 4 male and 3 female. Ahura Mazda is the supreme deity or creator of the world. He's a deity discussed by Zarathustra or Zoroaster. And in this sense, Pike explores the 47th problem of Euclid, utilizing the Amish Sepentas or the bountiful immortals, and this idea that they emanated from the divine. There are theories that it seem, at least in my mind, somewhat sound, that the idea of the Kabbalistic emanations could potentially be based in the Amish Sepentas. At least when you make connections, it kind of makes sense, perhaps not historically, but in an idea of transfer of knowledge. In any case, there are 4 male and 3 female. Interesting, again, if we think back to that 3, 4, 5 triangle. And it is worth noting, just as a side point, the 7-pointed star you see here, representative of Ahura Mazda and the Amish Sepentas, is in your text in a older format. Has the names of the Amish Sepentas, Vohumanu and Spentamanu, and several of those as they go through. But that is the great symbol of the 32nd degree itself, which hangs in the east, during the consecration of a Master of the Royal Secret, during the meeting of a consistory. So it's a very important symbol, really a profound thing to think on and contemplate. So, having digested all this, Pike comes to the conclusion that it is because Pythagoras saw in the right-angled triangle these representations of the faith taught by the Median Magi. So he says that basically Pythagoras saw in the right-angled triangle, the 3-4-5 triangle made by the theorem, a representation of Ahura Mazda, or the Amish Sepentas, or with the the 4 male and 3 female. And he learned that, of course, in Babylon, and that figure became a great symbol. And its discovery, of course, in its relationship, this idea of the continuation of representing the divine, was worthy to be commemorated by sacrifice. Of course, as with other things, Pike kind of tromps off into some other areas. He discusses for a little bit the idea of the lion and the eagle and their relationship. And of course, he talks about this idea that the Lion of the tribe of Judah and some of the phrasing used in Preston Webb ritual is not known outside of the United States. Brothers in England are said to be raised by the lion's grip or the lion's paw or eagle's claw. Pike thinks on that. He dwells on it a little bit. He comes to this idea that perhaps that grip, which references the lion, symbolizes divine wisdom and divine sovereignty coming together by the grip of the lion and the eagle. Both those animals said to represent that. So an interesting thing he kind of ends with. And of course, he then takes it further as he explores this idea of sacred numbers more, where he talks about 3-5-7 being related to the entered apprentice and master mason's degree and fellowcraft degree in terms of the steps made to the pedestal, or as we would say in Preston Webb work, to the altar. 3, 5, and 7. And he says, at least in the Master Mason's degree, there are said to be 3 steps over the grave and 4 bold steps. And he says that the over the grave steps are a very old custom, shown in many tracing boards, especially the French ones. And our text, of course, references a tracing board we looked at earlier in our discussions. So, with that said, we're now about to dig into these plates, these engravings, primarily as Pike explores where some of our symbolism in Freemasonry comes, where it originates, and how it comes into Masonry's keep. And this is kind of going back to Pike's idea that symbols and some of the esoteric natures of the fraternity and lessons come to us through the development of brethren who were hermetically inclined, alchemically inclined in their labors, in their research, antiquarians of one form or another who had done massive study on classical subjects, Rosicrucian thought, things like that, and how they came through. So we're going to dig into that. So take a second, step away, grab a drink, grab a snack. Be honest with you, the next section we're going to do is very free form. I'm going to hit on some key points with each of these images, make some of my own comments, but believe me, you can throw what I'm saying out with the bathwater, because these are, of course, your own interpretation. Pike often speaks to us about the idea of not interpreting symbols inappropriately in terms of the things symbolized for what the symbol is, and that type of idea. So I'm going to give you some base interpretations from the text. I'm going to give you some of my own little thoughts, but then it's up to you to take it from there. So take a second, grab that drink. We'll be right back, and we'll be waiting for you in just a moment. So we've already talked about this image, the rebus, before. It comes back up again in our text, page 201, 202. And Pike uses this and other plates to review some of his thoughts. Of course, most of these are from Hermetic texts. Most of these predate, all of these predate the fraternity. So let's keep that in mind as we explore these. Of course, some of these images come from text related or published under Basil Valentine or Basilius Valentinius. The rebus itself, 1613. Again, page 201, 202 begins our look at this. Pike does take a couple of pages to discuss several of these plates we're going to talk about. Then he circles back and talks about the rebus more as he kind of contemplates the relationship and some comparative thoughts. So this is a really neat section. I will say, honestly, when we do this with our own study groups here in St. Louis, we've had fantastic discussions. It turns into be one of the longer meetings we have as brothers pick apart the symbols and the arrangement and the interconnectedness. Really great discussions. So, of course, we have this orb. It's shaped in a way you could say it's an egg. The text even mentions that. The figure is, of course, half male, half female by head. The male side, of course, is bearded. The female, her arm is bare or uncovered. The male's arm is covered. The male, of course, has the compasses. The females has the square. You look at the top, we see the sun, the moon, Mercury in the middle. Mars and Jupiter on the left is represented by their glyphs and characters, Venus and Saturn on the right. Pike leverages his thoughts when he looks at this, and he makes some commentary about the numbers 4 and 3. The 3, of course, up top, the sun, the moon, Mercury, Hermes, if you want, in terms of a symbol, is aggregating them, and the 4 planets below, the Mars and Jupiter, Venus and Saturn. And he talks about how you can also look down on the orb and you see 3 and 4 with the triangle and the square. And he talks about this idea of this symbol representing not only the generative and productive power of nature, but also this idea of the potencies of the divine, the emanations of the divine, that would be known to the adepts. Keenly, of course, he notes that as we consider these in the arrangements of the planets, you can see the 3, the 4. You can also see 7 right there. And you can see 5 when you pull the sun and moon out and you just go with those 6-pointed stars. So you have 3, 5, 7 all shown right there in the arrangements of the planets. Pike takes his final thoughts on this symbol on page 205, 207 for you to consider. The second image he discusses, our plate number 2, is on page 203. We have a goblet, and I have always interpreted this as the sun and the moon pouring into the goblet. I've seen other approaches talk about pouring out of the goblet and into those things. Notice that directly below the goblet is Mercury. So you have the sun, the moon, Mercury again. To the left and right, we have, of course, Venus and Mars, or male and female signs. Perhaps you have some dichotomy between passive and aggressive energy. We have light and dark, as you see the one planetary sign in black and the other one inverted in that, and then not. So we have the negative and the positive images of that. You notice that the planets form a square around Hermes, perhaps representing a cube with Mercury in the middle. Thus, we have 4 planets around 1, and then 4, and then 1 is 5 as well. We see the shields. We have the eagle and lion. We talked about the eagle and lion representing divine wisdom and divine sovereignty. Pike here talks about this idea of the eagle representing divine wisdom and power, and the lion representing divine sovereignty. The double-headed figure, Pike alludes to being in a similar meaning of the rebus figure. Down towards the bottom of the image, we see this orb with a cross on it. Pike tells us, and we kind of from our own observations as we look at this, you could think of that as kind of the material world. Pike alludes to the fact that it's the 4 emanations ruling over the material world. There are, of course, spheres to the left and right, and they represent the spiritual and the material world, with the 7-pointed star between representing the divine potencies, whereas Pike would himself outline the 7 archangels. Around the exterior of this image is written in full Latin the statement that sums up to vitriol, visita interior terra rectificado in Venice cultum lapidum. which of course visit the interior of the earth and all that good stuff that comes with it, which we've discussed before. This, of course, reminds us of the 13th degree, wherein we see the statement in Ore Leonis in Vine Verbum, which I would direct your attention to if you're a Scottish Rite Mason for your own consideration. The third plate has a tree on it. Very simple, not a lot of the extra clutter, if you will, of some of the other plates. Has 3 roots. It has 7 branches. And if you consider the dispersal of the leaves, there's a variance between completeness and incompleteness, between growth and decay, especially poignantly, the easiest one that I noticed, and that Pike mentioned it several times, but I noticed the 2 top leaves. One is full and one is decayed. Of course, there's the sun and the moon. And then, of course, at the top of the apex of the top triangle, we have Mercury again. We have those other planets we've seen again dispersed in their orientation. Now, of course, this to me is very much an as above, so below sentiment. Reflection. We see in the inverted triangle, Mercury again. We see the cross with triangle above it, which is said to be frequently a symbol of deity. We have the cube, which Pike tells us means divine wisdom. And then, of course, Mercury being that messenger, the divine word. So we kind of have the symbolism of the divine there, as well as the sun, moon, and Mercury above, equally showing that trinity of the divine and his creation and the reflection of the ideas of as above, so below. The next image is kind of an intriguing one. It's actually part of a 4-plate series, depending upon the text you're looking at. And it's the final plate, wherein we see this king be representative of the body, separated from his spirit, which becomes his son. He then reintegrates the sun at some point, and goes through kind of an alchemical process. We're told that this plate is to represent the father now completely transformed, and that the good empire has created a new son for him. Here, the father, the son, and the guide are linked as one, and so they remain hereafter forever. Again, Pike uses these plates as kind of his justification of why and where some of the symbolism of Masonry may come from. Pike himself kind of throws out the idea that perhaps something like this is where the idea of the 3 Grand Masters came from. Hiram of Biff, Solomon, king of Israel, and Hiram of Tyre. In that same sentiment, we see kind of a symbolic journey with this idea of the 3 individuals, youth, age, perhaps manhood as well with the guide. But you also get this idea of the material, the spirit, the word in transit of them. Of course, they're all very close. We see some interesting symbolism between some more martial attire, more military attire with the sun, and more civil attire, of course, with the king. Of course, the king holding an orb and a scepter, the sun just with the scepter, the guide behind him, winged, wearing that liberty cap. A lot of neat symbolism in this one to kind of break down as we look at it, just in the characters, not so much in the surrounding per se. The 5th plate is a book plate, kind of interesting. Again, predates Masonry. We see 2 columns, 2 Doric columns on the sides. We have a bust in the middle with its head covered. We have these figures up at the top. We have some writing down below. You can find that all in full detail on page 218. It's a hodgepodge of things, though, on the one column. We have musical instruments. We have armor. We have some Masonic style tools and implements. A lot of different things. Kind of hodgepodge there. We have a numbers square, which we'll talk about in a minute. And we have some text. So at the top of the image, though, we do see a king and a queen. The king sitting on a lion. The queen seems to be sitting on maybe a dolphin or some type of sea creature. The king holding the sun, the queen, the moon. Between them is a representation of Hermes or Mercury. He has a six-pointed star he's holding in his hand with the symbols of the planets around it. Interestingly enough, you can make that out holding a caduceus in the other hand. In the middle of the image, you see this cloud. There's a scroll coming down. It's supposed to represent a horoscope. And of course, in Latin, we see the phrase that translates to the stars rule men. The scroll is said to hide a bust of a man. We see his name is Mercurio Phallus Anglius, which is likely to be Elias Ashmole, of course, an early member of the fraternity. The tree, where Pike kind of compares it to the idea of a burning bush, has from it coming another statement leading up to a cross with a head on it and an upside down crescent, representative of Mercury. And that statement in Latin is what is above, even like as that below. Now, of course, this set, the open scroll over on the side, I talked about the numbers, kind of an interesting symbol in itself. And you can see it's 5, 7, 8, 9, 2, 4, 1, 6, 8. No matter if you go across or down, you're going to get 15 in any way you hash it. And Pike looks at that and talks about the idea that it denotes the number of steps of a fellow craft, the number of fellow craft within the Preston Webb work, the age of an entered apprentice fellow craft master mason combined, as well as the combination of those sacred numbers 3, 5, 7. So he makes note of that. Of course, again, the two columns, there's a compass, there's a square, there's a level. There is some of the alchemical symbols of the sun, the moon, the master, with Mercury there. All of these ideas, the bush, Pike compares it to the burning bush himself even. All of these are comparable ideas that Pike said show potential, not that they are, but show potential symbols outside of Freemasonry, wherein early speculative Masons could have pulled ideas and thought processes. The next set plate we're going to look at, page 222, is a title page from De Lapide Philosophica Vera Philosophiae Doctrina from 1423. Again, my pronunciations are always going to be off. It's the Missouri in me that is not educated well enough. It's a very interesting image in general. We see, again, vitriol around the outside, written in Latin around the circle. We have the Ancient of Days represented in the middle. We have that king and queen again. The king with that lion, the queen with this time very clearly a dolphin. We have a symbol of fire on one side, obviously not a cup or water, probably being held in that cup on the other side. We have the sun, the moon, the cube at the base. We have anima, spiritus, corpus. So we're talking about body, spirit, and soul. Pike notes that the cube at the base, of course, can represent the finite universe. But here, his concept is this idea that it represents the Earth, surrounded by those 5 planets that were considered more key. Of course, at the top, we have a flaming lizard. We also have another bird. A lot of alchemical symbolism built in this. One of the neat things that I like to point out to brothers as they look at this image, and I apologize if it looks like I'm kind of looking off. I'm kind of following a second monitor where I've got a little bigger, is if you look at the image in the middle, it's about this bird or animal, kind of looks kind of human at some points, but it's about life, death, rectification or resurrection, that type of thing. And so you're seeing the process of life around that as we build those processes through things. So really neat symbol here. Really encourage you to dig into this one as well. A lot heaped into it. The next plate, very simply put, we have the sun, the moon, we have Mercury or Hermes in the middle. We have 2 men, one with a snake on one stick and the other with a bird on the other, trying to attack him. Here again, Pike keeps his thoughts on this one pretty simple. Says it's a representation of the sun, the moon, and the master, or the divine sovereignty, divine wisdom, and divine word. This is one of my favorite images, plate number 8. It's on page 225. because I think the more you look at it, the more it makes sense. The more you see some great symbolism in it. A couple things to note here as we look at this. You're very much seeing right in front of you, up front is a cross, a dead body. We have some type of angelic figure, perhaps, with wings and a scepter and a horn. You have a gentleman sowing seed, and you have birds picking away the seed up front. Now, the cross and a rectangle together form the glyph of what is known as the Sol hierarchy, which is said, at least in an alchemical sense, to cause all metals to evaporate, so whisk away. Of course, the crosses in the background, you notice there are also crosses farther back. They have kind of a pitched roof on them, and that represents the idea as an alchemical symbol of the formation of mercury with its own sulfur. So, going even farther out, in the back, we see a bullseye, but that bullseye very clearly could also be the alchemical symbol for gold or the sun. So I think what you see here, at least my interpretation, I'll share this one with you kind of full blast, is we have the death and the reaping, if you will, of the body. The body is decayed. Thus, you see the man planting it, planting seeds, planting life around it. Of course, some of that's being picked up and whisked away. Probably, in a way, you could say that field is his life. It's kind of how I've always looked at it. We have the grave. We have a man rising from the grave. There's grass growing from the edge of the grave, so it's a renewal of life. And then, of course, you have the bullseye being hit with those arrows, that success. So I think you have the process of alchemy kind of demonstrated here visually, this idea of purification, death, whisking away, new life, new growth, new results, pushing you forward through the fermentation process to the light, to gold, whatever you may want to think. It's my kind of rough look at this. The last image we have here is a triangle. Very simply, Pike just kind of deciphers it for us, translating the exterior of the triangle. It comes up to, I am born from Homogenes, Hyperion elected me. Without Ansoff, I must necessarily die. Of course, we also have the sun, moon, Mercury, or Hermes represented there. Ansoff, of course, coming from a Kabbalistic perspective, is the cause of causes. Now, taking the interior written language, Pike kind of dabs into this, and he notices the first word is did-ka, or did-ha, which no such word exists, but dot-ka, which is to fear, venerate, appears. So he could translate that to he who has veneration. The next word he translates to meaning with heart, followed by brave or vigorous. And in the center, he comes up with tan-bat. No such word exists, and by the addition of those letters, he creates the phrase seal or signer. The last word, ko la cho, meaning in thy perfection. So then he comes to this summation of basically brave and vigorous with heart. He who has veneration is in thy perfection is sealed. Pike kind of talks a little bit about that. I just draw your attention to it. Kind of an interesting thing. So the next part of the text we dive into are the fragments. These are exceedingly interesting. And this is the last part we're going to touch on. The endnotes section I'm going to leave to you to delve into. I think it's really kind of one of those things you should get your own feet wet on. But you need to read through it, just because as we go through the endnotes, it gets very disjointive for me to discuss it, because I'm going to be jumping all over the place, worse than if I'm kind of following Pike's jumping over occasionally. So I'm going to leave the endnote section to you to read, but we are going to talk through the fragments. And the fragments are sections of the work that Pike just didn't do a full chapter on. He begins by talking about truth and what it is. And he says it's a supreme virtue, the sovereign good, which is not obscured by matter nor circumscribed by the body, the naked good, evident, unalterable, august, and immutable. Now, of course, the Apostle James tells us that every benefaction and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. And so Pike ties this to this idea of truth. The truth is good. It comes from the divine. Elias Ashmole himself in 1658 in The Way to Bliss says that the mind and the wit of man is but a spark of the divine and great man. Of course, that truth is great and mighty of all things is divine wisdom, inanimate as deity, whereby he is deemed to have created the universe, Pike tells us. The next topic, Pike explores the cable tow. We know Pike's not a fan. We've talked about it already at length several times now. I think we're up to 3 or 4. But Pike breaks down the word. He says, there's no existence of it in English anywhere. So let's look to Hebrew. Let's look to other languages. And he comes to Hebrew. He comes to kabel, meaning a rope, cord, maybe a cable attached to an anchor. And he says the same word is used in Ezekiel to reference binding or a pledge. To is used as a suffix, and it means his. So Pike's idea was that Tubal Cain means his pledge, and it signifies the scope and intent of the spirit of one's pledge. So that was his actual exploration of that. This idea that is a physical idea, or as a physical thing, yeah, it's a cable or rope. But when we put it in this context here too, it is also your pledge. Pike takes a moment to discuss cornerstones as well. Of course, cornerstones in masonry, we talk about them. We do ceremonies for them, all this good stuff. He says, of course, custom says we lay in the northeast corner. Yet he points to the fact that the Capitol building in D.C., when they laid it, was in the southeast corner. Now, why is each cornerstone in each place? Or excuse me, why is each cornerstone in each place? Why are ashlars used? That type of thing. Pike kind of rips that apart, discusses it. He talks about the north side of the lodge being for entered apprentices who compose a considerable number of the craft. Most of them would take up that side on the north. That's why we place a rough ashlar over there. The south side of the lodge, of course, belonged to fellow crafts, potentially some master masons. Smaller number, smaller quantity, so perfect ashlar there. And a cornerstone is a perfect ashlar, keeping that in mind. Pike does take a moment to discuss the ladder of Jacob. According to Hargrave Jennings, Pike talks about the fact that the ladder, in regards to the Kabbalah, is a metaphorical representation of the powers of alchemy. And Pike discusses it a little bit. He takes about a page to do it. But he does point out the fact that there is nothing in Genesis that tells us how many rungs are on the ladder, whether it's 3 or 7 or whatever it may be. Genesis 28:12 tells us only, and he dreamed, and lo, a ladder was set upon the earth, and top of it reached to heaven, and lo, the angels of God ascending and descending it. Pike's next run is on words. Specifically, he addresses things like Tubal Cain, Shibboleth, and Solomon. So Tubal Cain, of course, in the Bible, we're told that he's an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. He's a son of Lamech and Zillah, and the brother of Nehemiah. Of course, that's the English translations of the Bible. Pike says that that's a little bit off. When you go to the Hebrew, he's actually a beater, sharpener, or polisher of every work of brass and iron. Very clearly, he is a blacksmith. And his name perhaps has some symbolism. Pike says that Tubal means fertile land, and Cain means brought forth or created. Thus, one could suppose through an examination of his name that it meant maybe creator of the world. Pike believes this is not the case. He thinks that's not why this association was made. Rather, he believes it is because he is the first artisan that was mentioned. So there was some push at the time, at least in one way or another, through opinions that maybe Tubal Cain is this divine presence, if you will, from perhaps a Gnostic thought process. Pike says, no, I really think it was more, he's the first artisan. The next thing Pike talks about is shibboleth in regards to it being a word or used as comparison in discussion. He talks about the word sabalat, which means a stream of water or an ear of corn. And he says that the true difference in pronunciation of the word is really unknown. We don't know the difference. But he feels, considering the story behind it, considering its use, that it was perhaps selected in allusion to the contentious relationship at that time in England between certain Masons and the populations in England that were present, relating specifically to how things were pronounced by say, Stuart supporters and Highlanders versus those south of the Tweed. So at that time, the Grand Lodge of England, the Moderns, was very, very pro Hanoverian, very pro government. The ancients, of course, you probably have more Stuart supporters, Highlanders, English foreign, so outside of London, outside of England itself, Scots, Irish, and the like involved in that group. So Pike thinks maybe there's an allusion here to that separation. The next thing Pike talks about a little bit is Solomon. And he takes several jabs at this because, again, he's addressing words, he's addressing meanings, and he talks about this nonsense that the Grand Lodge of New York at the time was pushing, where they talked about Solomon being associated with the sacred word, the sun, all these other things. Of course, Pike points out that Solomon is a misunderstanding of his true name, which is more like Salama. And Pike thinks there is no mystical meaning to his name, no more than David, Job, or Tyre could have a mystic name. And I've listed on the slides Daud, Ayub, and Sur, which I'm sure, again, mispronouncing those. So somebody someday can kind of walk me through it all a lot better. But he talks about the fact that we've obviously changed some of the names that they were probably said in our modern day and that type of thing, and no more symbolism is hid by that than anything else. He goes on to talk about, it's a humbug, of course, for us to talk about Solomon being a Greek word. It's not the name of the sun repeated. And he says such displays of Masonic learning, entomology, etc., give good reason why real scholars feel that our studies and our lore are hogwash and give us contempt. He, of course, then takes a little bit of time to talk about Hiram Abiff and this idea that Abi means my father, or Abu of his father, and means generally a magistrate or rabbi. Pike ties that in, of course, to the story of Joseph, who was a counselor for the Pharaoh, who was called Ab of the Pharaoh, or Abi of the Pharaoh. So interesting connotation there. Beyond that, my brothers, the rest of the material is going to be covering the fragments of content. And I'm going to show these slides, but there'll be no audio to them, just for your reference, because it really is kind of a disjointed discussion as we're just flipping through page to page, referencing back some other things. I would point out, though, please review these slides. Take some time to look at them in the actual video. If you're listening to this, take some time. There's about 10 slides of notes on other fragments that we'll be covering here and showing you in a minute. Brethren, we hope you had a little bit of time to soak in those slides, take some thoughts there. Please look at that material. Just because it's so disjunctive, it would seem pretty awkward if I were to go through slide by slide and jump about more than I already am awkward. In any case, thank you for joining us on this journey through Master Craftsman Symbolic Lodge. We are excited to have you with us. Thank you for supporting Masonic education, being a part of Masonic education. And remember, Masonic education matters. We're excited to bring more opportunities here from the Valley of St. Louis to other valleys, to other brothers across the jurisdiction. And we're glad to make those opportunities available as best we can. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day, morning, evening, and check out the rest of the courses as we have those lectures provided.